Okay, this is part 2 of the drawing tutorial to do a ribbon lettering project like this. So in part 1, we learned how to make the line drawing, and that's where we are. So now we're going to start with the shading. The place that I like to start when I'm doing the shading is with the darker parts, the shadows. So I've got several pencils to work with. I'm going to start with my lighter one, so either an HB or in this case just my normal number 2 pencil. They're really the same. I'm going to have a piece of paper towel here that's big enough that while I'm working, if I want to shade up here, I can rest my hand here without accidentally smudging my drawing. And then I'm also going to have another piece of paper towel that I fold. So this is a pretty small one, just a little scrap here. And I'm just going to keep folding that over and over until I can't fold it anymore, which eventually is going to give me pretty much a rectangular shape. And then my last fold, which that was pretty much my last fold, I'm going to fold it into a triangle. So that could be at the corner, or you could do it some other way, but that'll give me a blending tool that I didn't have to pay for. Okay, so yeah, so where I want to do some of the shadows, the darker shadows are going to be wherever 2 parts of the ribbon cross. So this part is going on top of this part, here and here. So at those 2 points, those are going to be some of our darkest shadows. So I always want to start by going with the line, so going this way, but you'll notice I'm making that very, very small. I'm not going all the way up to either side, because then I can actually change directions and I can very carefully go with the ribbon in the other direction and then just carefully connect those 2. So I'm doing that on both sides. So here I've created a buffer zone, and then I'm going to keep going in this direction as I shade, because that's going to be easier. So you want to mainly go with the long direction of the ribbon, but when you're at the edge going the opposite way, you're going to start that way to create your buffer zone. Okay, so right here we're going to go pretty dark. Like I said, I am starting with my lighter pencil, so generally speaking, I won't go to the darkest I can do right away, but this will still be pretty dark, and then I can come back and make it even darker later. So just in general, that's kind of how you want to work. So notice as I keep going, I'm using these really, really small marks, and I can go over them a little bit more to make it a little bit darker. So go over something twice or more times, or not do that. And so my marks will get lighter if I'm both pressing more lightly and not going over them multiple times. So I want to make sure this is smooth. So if you see a place where maybe it's a little bit, like a bit of a line there, I would just go into that place and just add some more very small marks. So I don't necessarily have to go over the places that are already the darkest. In fact, I don't want to. Instead, I'm going to go over the places where it's getting a little bit lighter, but maybe not transitioning quite as smoothly as I want it to. So sorry for the camera going in and out of focus. Try to get that back to being focused for you. There we go. All right, so you can see how that's going. If you're having a hard time getting this to transition to the white smoothly, you can try kind of separating little lines, so you're essentially hatching. You could even do little tiny dots and then just let those fade out. So we want this to be as smooth as possible. And you do want to shade all the way up to these two pencil lines, these edges. All right, so that's basically how it's going to work. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm also going to do the same thing here and here, because this part of the ribbon goes on top. And a place like over here, this part of the ribbon is on top, and this part of the ribbon is behind. So again, I'm going to start right here, right next to the edge, first going side to side this way. But then before I get to this line that goes the other direction, I'm going to pause and start going that direction. So again, I've created that little buffer zone. Now here, since there's a curve, I can just sort of naturally start transitioning my line in that direction. So again, just starting out dark, making really, really small marks. These are like maybe 1/8 of an inch, maybe. So the smaller your marks, the more you can control them. And that's what this assignment is all about. It's about learning how to create these smooth gradations and control your pencil lines and your pencil shading. All right. So you get the general picture. There's no set rule to how quickly you want to do these transitions. So one of the things that I've seen in some tutorials about this same project is that they'll actually mark out some areas where they want highlights. And so you can do this even before you start your shading. So I decided with mine, in my example, that I would have my light source coming from over here, so the right side and kind of above. So I was looking for all the places that would be sort of at the top and sort of toward the right. So here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. Here's one kind of, I kind of had to, it wasn't very big, and I had to make my shadow there, so I kind of had to fudge it. But you notice that there are also other parts that are light, so those aren't going to be our only highlights. Okay, so as I was saying, these areas that are to the right and top of each part of the ribbon, those aren't the only places that are going to be light. So I went ahead and found a few examples of photographs of ribbons online so that you can see how in these photographs of real ribbons there are these light areas throughout the ribbon. So they kind of appear at all these different places because of reflected light. So it is natural that we're going to have dark areas and light areas even in the middle of the ribbon. And you'll notice too that now sometimes light just doesn't behave the way you think it does and how it theoretically would. So with this project, we are going to learn some of these things, some of these sort of theoretical ways that light behaves, which is if one thing is behind another, it's going to be darker. Now that's not always true in reality, but having that darker value behind is going to help your brain see that part of the piece as farther back. And so if it's behind or it's under, those are the places where you want to add darker values. Lighter areas are going to appear to pop forward to your eye. So if you need to make something pop forward, so like this part of the ribbon, this part of the ribbon, this part of the ribbon, anywhere where the ribbon is overlapping another section and you want this section to appear to pop forward, wherever that happens, if you make that lighter, that's going to help your brain see it as being forward, closer to you. And then, of course, often sort of higher parts will have a light source hitting them, because our light source is oftentimes from above. Not always, but often. All right, so back to what that means for continuing to shade your drawing. So if you want to think about a light source, so again, I'm going to use one that happens to be from above and to the right. You can look to see, okay, what might be some areas. Okay, maybe the light would hit here. So I'm going to very, very lightly not make a solid line there. But I'm just making those very, very light kind of hatch marks there. All right. And I could do this over here, if this is where I think the other side of that highlight will be. So I could continue to do that. So maybe I would do this over here as well. And I think, okay, maybe this is where that light will catch. Maybe I would want to do that on some of these letters. The way I've chosen to do this, though, it might conflict with where there's going to be a shadow here, but we can try to make this work. So I might go through and try to find these places. I don't really consider these set in stone, though. We're going to have many more areas that have highlights, and some of these that we plan out may not work out quite as well as we thought for various reasons. So I could keep going around and finding other places that I think would make sense to put a highlight on. If I'm sort of thinking about things coming from the top right of the paper, of the drawing. But some of this is just going to happen naturally. So we're going to basically throughout be going from these dark areas, then fading out to light, then getting darker again, and repeat. So here, if I know that here I've got a shadow, and here maybe I'm going to want to highlight, I could just make this shadow keep going and make that gradation just take a longer time. And one thing that I can do to make that happen, I could go a little bit darker. So I just switched over to my ebony pencil. So I don't have to press too hard to make this a little darker. And then I would continue to lighten up and let this fade out. And then I can switch pencils as well as needed. One thing that is really important as you're shading, if you want a lot of detail and precision and really good craftsmanship, making sure your pencils are just really sharp really helps. So this one is pretty sharp, but the ebony doesn't have as fine a point as some of the others. So you may choose to use one that you can get a little bit of a finer point on if you want. But then just make sure that you keep sharpening it. Okay, so I'm continuing to change. So this might be my HB pencil now, or it just happens that I have the 2B. Or I'm sorry, not the 2B. Number 2, just a normal pencil, normal writing pencil here. And so I could just draw this out until I get all the way to over here. And again, we don't want this to be a hard edge here, so that's why I'm doing this. I did that as kind of a jagged line to begin with. I'm trying to rush a little bit, but even if I'm rushing a little bit, you still want those really, really small marks. And so if I'm having trouble kind of making this fade out all the way, one option is to make little stippling or hatching marks. And then of course you can also, we took the time to fold this, so we can also use that. And remember, if you are using the blending tool, these softer pencils are going to spread quite a lot. So you're going to need to be careful it doesn't swallow up all the white that you wanted to leave. So if it's swallowing up too much white, you can always go back with one of your erasers, like this kneaded eraser, and see how I'm kind of just tapping at this. That'll help you create your gradation as you erase. So almost like stippling, but in reverse. So that's the basic idea. One area, let's see, what didn't we talk about? So one of the things that I kind of alluded to is a lot of these lighter areas I didn't necessarily plan out. I didn't plan every single highlight. So I planned some of them, but then I just went ahead and just, you know, once if I was doing a shadow here and another shadow here, it just made sense to have it fade out to white in between. So some of this will just kind of happen naturally, and you can add more gradations going from dark to light to dark again, just to keep it interesting. So this part of the ribbon is an example of that. So there had to be any dark spots, but otherwise it would get pretty boring over here. So here I knew this was going to be dark, so I wanted this to be a little bit lighter. But I figured, okay, I can kind of catch a shadow here as it comes up. I can catch a shadow here. This area, because it curves back, that was why I decided to make this a little bit darker here. So, and notice how I kept this light so there'd be contrast, but then I started this little shadow that just kind of comes right to that edge and then fades out. So again, just so I can create some interest there. Think of that like in music, you have crescendos and decrescendos. In other words, you get louder and softer at different parts in the music, just to keep it interesting. Same thing here, but we're using value. All right, I think that's all I really have to say at this point in the tutorial. So happy shading. Good luck. Remember, keep your marks really small, give yourself a buffer zone, and then start going in the direction that the ribbon goes that long way. If you're trying to fight it by going this direction, that's just going to cause you trouble. All right, good luck. Okay, I've been continuing to shade off camera for a little bit. So a few things to add. One thing is, you can kind of see how I'm going in here, starting at darker places, letting it go to white, and then we'll continue back. And to create the other side of that highlight, I'm just starting really, really light. So I'm not making a hard line at any of those places where I know I wanted to have a highlight, because highlights and shadows don't usually have hard edges. More typically they have these soft edges. So then from there I'm just getting a little bit darker as I go. I may get all the way to my darkest dark, I may not, because then I'm going to want to leave this pretty light over here so that I, one, have contrast with those two shadows, and also the light value will make this pop forward. So just going a little bit darker, little by little. These smooth transitions. Right. So get even darker and then start getting lighter again. And then over here on this end, I would again probably pick up a light value scale again over here, and then get darker and lighter as I go this way. Another area that I wanted to point out was right here. So as I was going through here, I was thinking, oh, this might be a nice place for a highlight. But the way that I have this drawn, I would have the shadow right there, and it kind of makes that highlight a little bit weird. So one thing you can do, if you can go back, I can see here I had a cross here, and I just randomly picked which side to erase. So I could put that cross back there, and then flip-flop, change my decision, and say, okay, now I'll have this part of the ribbon above, and this part will be below. And then that helps me a little bit with wanting to leave a highlight where I did at sort of that top right of that part of the letter. So again, I'm creating my shadow there. I'm going to gradually get lighter, so etc. Up here, so we talked about, yes, we want to create a difference here, a contrast, so we want this to be light, but we also want this part to be highlighted. And I also mentioned when we were looking at my previous example that when something curves back, that's often a good place to make it a little bit shadowed. So if you think about how a curve works, the part that is the edge is going back in space, and then the part that is not right at the edge is probably a little bit closer to you as the viewer. It's popping out forward. So I can do that on here by having a little bit of a light value along this edge. So maybe just a light or maybe even a medium gray here. And notice how I did that and I just left a little bit of white right there next to my shadow. So you can do that. It's going to appear like it's just the very edge of the ribbon. And then I can keep going even lighter to start that highlight. Now I've got a little bit more room. I could actually start it a little bit earlier than I was going to previously. And then, again, over on this other side, I can get darker. And then this works out. I'd already said that this part was going to go under. So it's a little bit of a weird flip-flop, but you could probably make it work. Or if that feels too weird, you could always change it like we did on this side. There's a few other places where you're going to think about what's in front and what's on back. So this is an area where this part of the ribbon goes in front, but there was another that was in back of it. So that's another place where you're just using that rule of the part that's underneath, you're going to make a little bit darker. So later on, we'll be doing some drawing from photos or from direct observation. So sometimes in the real world, things don't follow these rules, but you can always go back to these rules if you need to in order to make something a little more dramatic. So if you've got two things that are next to each other and there's not enough contrast, you can always choose to make the one that's behind a little bit darker, and therefore it'll make the part that is supposed to be in front pop forward more for you. And so even in here, I can try to create a little bit of a gradation, making it darker along that edge.